Get your hands off the steering wheel right now, or I will light you up. Officer Derek Foster screamed, his knuckles white around the grip of his Axon Taser 7. Officer, keep your voice down. I am a federal agent. My credentials are... Pop. Bzzzt. The crackle of 50,000 volts tearing through the muggy night air silenced the man's sentence. Special Agent Curtis Jackson convulsed violently against the leather seat of his Dodge Charger, gasping for air. Derek Foster smiled, convinced he had just taken down another street thug. He didn't realize he had just completely destroyed his own life. The oppressive July humidity hung over the streets of Cobb County, Georgia, like a wet wool blanket. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the roads were sparsely populated, slicked with the oily sheen of a recent, brief thunderstorm. Inside Patrol Cruiser 412, Officer Derek Foster drummed his fingers aggressively against the steering wheel. Foster was an 8-year veteran of the Cobb County Police Department, a man whose personnel file was as thick as a phone book, riddled with excessive force complaints that had miraculously been swept under the rug by a complacent union rep. Foster saw himself as the thin blue line personified. In reality, he was a ticking time bomb of unchecked ego and implicit bias. He wore his uniform a size too tight, his tactical vest loaded with unnecessary gear, extra magazines, a backup boot knife, and a swagger that alienated even his own partners. Tonight, he was riding solo, hunting for a reason to exert authority. Cruising down the South Cobb Drive corridor, Foster's eyes locked onto a dark grey 2021 Dodge Charger RT. The vehicle was immaculate, its tinted windows barely legal, its exhaust purring with a low, menacing hum. It wasn't speeding, it wasn't swerving, it was simply existing in a space Foster felt belonged to him. Behind the wheel of the Charger sat Special Agent Curtis Jackson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, attached to the Atlanta Field Office's Violent Crimes Task Force. Jackson was 42, a former Marine with 15 years of impeccable federal service. He was bone-tired. He had just wrapped up a grueling 14-hour undercover surveillance operation tracking a transnational trafficking ring. He was wearing dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt, his Glock 19 Gen 5 secured in a minimalist inside-the-waistband holster at his right hip. His FBI gold badge and credentials were tucked safely inside his left breast pocket. He just wanted to get home to his wife, listen to some late-night jazz, and sleep. Foster pulled his cruiser 2 car lengths behind the Charger. He ran the plates through the Georgia Crime Information Center, GCIC database. The return came back clean, registered to a P.O. box in downtown Atlanta, a common security measure for federal law enforcement, though Foster didn't recognize the nuance. To Foster, a black man driving a late-model muscle car with tinted windows in this neighborhood was a target. "Let's see what we got here," Foster muttered to himself, a predatory smirk curling his lips. He waited for the Charger to change lanes to avoid a pothole. Jackson used his turn signal, but according to Foster's subjective, biased judgment, he hadn't signaled a full 100 feet prior to the lane change, a minor traffic code violation rarely enforced unless an officer is looking for a pretextual stop. Foster slammed his hand onto the light panel. The red and blue strobes erupted, washing the dark street in a chaotic, blinding glow. The siren gave a brief, aggressive wail. In the Charger, Curtis Jackson sighed heavily. He glanced in his rearview mirror at the flashing lights. He knew the drill. As a seasoned law enforcement officer, Jackson immediately executed the standard safety protocols to put the officer at ease. He didn't pull over on the dark shoulder. Instead, he rolled 100 yards up to a brightly lit Chevron gas station, parking squarely under the fluorescent canopy. Jackson killed the engine. He rolled down all 4 windows to provide complete visibility into the cabin. He reached up and turned on the interior dome light. Finally, he placed both of his large hands flat at the 12 o'clock position on the steering wheel, remaining perfectly still. It was a textbook, courteous response designed to ensure the safety of everyone involved. But Officer Derek Foster wasn't looking for courtesy. He was looking for compliance, subservience, and a bruised ego waiting to be stroked. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stepped out into the humid Georgia night, and rested his right hand firmly on the grip of his holstered service weapon as he began his slow, aggressive approach toward the driver's side window. The stage was set for a collision between a seasoned professional and a badge-heavy bully. The heavy footsteps of Officer Foster echoed under the metal canopy of the Chevron station. Instead of approaching the B-pillar, the standard tactical position, Foster marched aggressively right up to the driver's side window, projecting an aura of immediate hostility. He shined his high-lumen streamlight flashlight directly into Curtis Jackson's eyes, a deliberate and unnecessary provocation given the interior dome light was already illuminating the cabin perfectly. "License, registration and proof of insurance, right now!" Foster barked, his voice dripping with condescension. There was no "good evening," no explanation for the stop, just an immediate, hard demand. Jackson blinked against the blinding beam of the flashlight, keeping his hands glued to the steering wheel. He kept his voice steady, calm and modulated, the tone of a man who had negotiated with cartel enforcers and armed bank robbers. "Good evening, officer," Jackson replied smoothly. "Before I reach for anything, I need to inform you that I am an off-duty federal law enforcement officer. I'm armed. My weapon is holstered on my right hip, and my credentials are in my left breast pocket. How would you like me to proceed?" It was the exact phrase every armed off-duty officer is trained to say to avoid fatal misunderstandings. But the words seemed to short-circuit Derek Foster's brain. Foster looked at the black man in the plain T-shirt sitting in the expensive muscle car, and his inherent biases flared into pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't see a brother in blue. He saw a liar trying to play a game. "Yeah, right, and I'm the damn President of the United States," Foster sneered, leaning closer to the window, his breath smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "I said, give me your ID, stop stalling, or I'm pulling you out of this vehicle." Jackson's jaw tightened, but his discipline held firm. He knew that any sudden movement, even to retrieve his FBI badge, could give this erratic, hyper-aggressive cop the excuse he was desperately searching for. "Officer, I am perfectly willing to provide my identification," Jackson said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the unmistakable cadence of authority. "But as I stated, I am armed. If I reach into my pocket, my hands will move toward my waistline. For both of our safety, I'm keeping my hands on the wheel. You can call your watch commander, or you can retrieve the credentials from my pocket yourself." Foster's face turned a mottled crimson. He wasn't used to being spoken to with such calm logic, and he certainly wasn't used to being instructed on procedure by a motorist. To Foster, Jackson's composed demeanor was an insult. It was a challenge to his absolute authority. "Don't you tell me how to do my job, boy!" Foster yelled, his hand leaving his firearm and dropping to the bright yellow Axon Taser 7, holstered on his left side. "You're refusing a lawful order. Unlock this door right now." "I am not refusing an order. I am trying to prevent a tragedy," Jackson replied calmly. "Check the plates. Call it in. You will see my vehicle is registered." "Step out of the vehicle! Now!" Foster roared, his professionalism entirely evaporated. He violently yanked on the driver's side door handle. Jackson, anticipating the escalation, had already unlocked the doors to prevent the officer from breaking the window and causing further chaos. The heavy door swung open. Jackson remained in his seat, his hands still visible, gripping the leather of the steering wheel. He looked Foster dead in the eyes. "Officer, you are making a grave mistake," Jackson warned, his voice steady but carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. "I am Special Agent Curtis Jackson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. De-escalate this situation immediately." The mention of the FBI should have been a bucket of ice water over Foster's head. It should have prompted him to take a step back, radio for a supervisor, and proceed with caution. But Foster's ego was a runaway train. In his twisted mind, he was being defied, humiliated in the parking lot of a gas station. He unholstered his taser, the plastic weapon bright and menacing in the artificial light. "I don't care who you claim to be," Foster snarled, pointing the taser directly at Jackson's chest. "You are under arrest for failure to comply. Get your hands off the steering wheel right now, or I will light you up." Jackson sighed, realizing reasoning with the man was impossible. "Officer, keep your voice down. I am a federal agent. My credentials are—" Foster didn't wait. He didn't assess the threat. He simply pulled the trigger. Pop. BZZZZ. The twin probes of the Axon Taser 7 exploded from the cartridge, trailing thin, conductive wires. They struck Curtis Jackson squarely in the center of his chest, the barbed tips piercing through his cotton T-shirt and embedding into his skin. Instantly, 50,000 volts of electricity hijacked Jackson's nervous system. Neuromuscular incapacitation took hold. Jackson's massive shoulders seized up. His hands, previously resting peacefully on the steering wheel, clenched into tight, agonizing fists. His back arched violently against the car seat as a guttural groan of pure agony escaped his clenched teeth. The pain was blinding, a white-hot fire burning through his veins, rendering him completely paralyzed. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Foster screamed at the top of his lungs, a phrase practically ingrained in him as a magical legal shield, despite the fact that Jackson was physically incapable of doing anything but suffering. The 5-second cycle felt like an eternity. When the electricity finally cut off, Jackson slumped forward against the steering wheel, gasping for oxygen, his muscles twitching uncontrollably, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Before Jackson could even draw a full breath, Foster lunged into the vehicle. He grabbed the collar of Jackson's shirt and violently hauled the exhausted, disoriented FBI agent out of the car. Jackson's knees buckled as his boots hit the concrete, the residual effects of the taser making his legs feel like lead. Foster slammed Jackson face first into the side of the Charger. The impact rattled Jackson's teeth. "Put your hands behind your back," Foster barked, shoving his knee hard into the small of Jackson's back, right next to where the concealed Glock was holstered. Foster felt the hard outline of the firearm. "Gun! He's got a gun!" Foster yelled into his shoulder mic, his voice laced with feigned panic, playing up the drama for the body camera he knew was recording. He quickly snatched the Glock 19 from Jackson's waistband, tossing it carelessly onto the trunk of the car. "I told you I was armed," Jackson wheezed, his face pressed against the cold metal of his own vehicle. "Federal agent." "Shut up!" Foster hissed, yanking Jackson's arms backward with excessive force. He slapped a pair of Smith & Wesson steel handcuffs onto Jackson's wrists, ratcheting them down so tight they instantly bit into the skin, restricting blood flow. Foster stepped back, admiring his work. The suspect was subdued, disarmed and cuffed. In Foster's mind, he was a hero. He had just taken a dangerous, armed individual off the streets. "Dispatch, this is 412. I need a transport unit at the Chevron on South Cobb. One suspect in custody, resisting arrest, possession of a concealed firearm. Taser deployed." Foster casually spoke into his radio, his heart rate barely elevated. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the night. 2 more Cobb County cruisers pulled into the gas station. Backup officers poured out looking at the scene. They saw a black man in handcuffs leaning against a car, and Foster standing tall and proud. "Good work, Foster. You good?" asked Officer Miller, a young rookie. "Yeah, I'm good. Guy was non-compliant, had a concealed weapon. Tried to tell me he was FBI. Foster laughed, shaking his head. "Tased him into next week." They dragged Jackson, still recovering from the neuromuscular shock, to the back of a plastic-seated transport cruiser. Jackson didn't fight them. He didn't curse. As they forced his head down to clear the doorframe, Jackson locked eyes with Foster. The look in the FBI agent's eyes wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. It was the cold, calculating stare of a man who knew the machinery of the federal government was about to descend upon this arrogant cop like an avalanche. "Check the left breast pocket, officer," Jackson said quietly before the door slammed shut. Foster scoffed, ignoring the remark. He moved to process the Charger for towing, completely unaware that the clock on his career and his freedom had just started counting down. The Cobb County Police Precinct holding area smelled of pine sol and stale sweat. It was 1:15 a.m. Curtis Jackson sat on a metal bench in a cinder block cell, his wrists throbbing, his chest burning where the taser prongs had been roughly yanked out by a dismissive paramedic. He remained silent, observing the circus around him with the analytical eye of a trained investigator. Out in the bullpen, Officer Derek Foster was holding court. He was leaning against a desk, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, regaling 3 other officers with an exaggerated tale of the traffic stop. "I'm telling you, the guy was squaring up," Foster lied smoothly, confident that his fellow officers would never question his narrative. Refused to step out, kept reaching for his waistband, had to deploy the Axon, dropped him like a sack of potatoes. Across the room at the intake desk, Sergeant Hank Miller, a 20-year veteran with a receding hairline and a profound exhaustion for paperwork, was logging the suspect's belongings. The Glock 19 was tagged and boxed. The wallet was next. Miller opened the thick leather wallet. The first thing he saw wasn't a Georgia driver's license. It was a heavy, gleaming gold shield recessed into the leather, flanked by a laminated identification card. Miller squinted. He adjusted his reading glasses. The words on the badge seemed to burn into his retinas. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent. The ID card bore a stern-faced photograph of the man currently sitting in holding cell 3, alongside the seal of the United States Department of Justice. All the blood drained from Sergeant Miller's face. His stomach dropped into his shoes. "Hey, Foster," Miller called out, his voice cracking slightly. The bullpen went quiet. "Yeah, Sarge. What's up? Found his rap sheet?" Foster chuckled, walking over to the desk. Miller didn't laugh. He slowly turned the wallet around so Foster could see it. "Foster, who the hell did you arrest?" Miller whispered harshly. Foster looked down. His eyes landed on the gold badge. For a few seconds his brain refused to process the information. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. "It's a fake," he told himself. "Has to be a fake." "It's a prop, Sarge. Guy's impersonating a federal officer. Add it to the charges," Foster said, though his voice lacked its previous bravado. A cold sweat began to prickle at the back of his neck. Miller shook his head slowly. "Foster, I've seen fake badges. This isn't a fake. The microprinting on the ID, the DOJ watermarks. This is real." Miller looked up, his eyes wide with rising panic. "You tased a federal agent. You tased an armed FBI agent." The silence in the precinct was deafening. The other officers slowly backed away from Foster, distancing themselves from the radioactive blast radius of his monumental screw-up. "So what?" Foster stammered, his arrogance desperately trying to shield his rising terror. He was driving erratically. He refused a lawful order. The law applies to the feds, too. "You better pray your body cam footage backs up every single word you just said, Derek," Miller said grimly. The sergeant picked up the precinct's landline. He didn't dial the local chief. He bypassed the chain of command entirely. He dialed the emergency liaison number for the FBI's Atlanta field office. Within 10 minutes, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted from a sleepy midnight shift to absolute lockdown. The local chief of police arrived in sweatpants and a windbreaker, looking pale. Then, the front double doors of the precinct blew open. 4 men in sharp, dark suits and tactical vests strode into the room. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose. At their center was Assistant Special Agent in Charge, ASAC, Robert Vance. Vance was a terrifyingly calm man, a former prosecutor whose eyes missed nothing. Vance walked straight up to Sergeant Miller's desk, bypassing Foster completely as if the local cop were an insect. "I am ASAC Vance, FBI. You have Special Agent Curtis Jackson in custody," Vance said, his voice quiet but echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Release him. Immediately." Miller fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Foster, feeling his entire reality crumbling, stepped forward, a desperate, foolish attempt to maintain his authority. "Hold on a second. He committed a traffic violation. He resisted arrest. This is my collar." Vance slowly turned his head to look at Derek Foster. The sheer contempt in the federal agent's eyes made Foster physically step back. "Officer Foster, is it?" Vance asked softly. "In about 5 minutes, we are seizing the memory card from your Axon body camera as evidence in a federal investigation. If that footage shows my agent resisting, we will handle it. But if that footage shows what I know it will show..." Vance leaned in close. "But you should enjoy wearing that badge tonight, officer, because it is the last time you will ever wear it." The release of Special Agent Curtis Jackson was swift and silent. He walked out of the holding cell, rubbing his raw, bruised wrists. He didn't look at Foster. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded to ASAC Vance, retrieved his weapon and badge, and walked out the door. The absolute silence from Jackson was somehow more terrifying to Foster than if he had screamed and threatened to sue. It was the silence of a man who knew the hammer of God was about to fall. By 8 a.m. the following morning, the hammer struck. Officer Derek Foster was summoned to the Internal Affairs Division. When he walked into the interrogation room, he wasn't met by his usual friendly IA sergeant. Instead, he found the Chief of Police, a union lawyer looking deeply uncomfortable, and 2 agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. "Have a seat, Derek," the chief said. He didn't call him officer. On the table sat a laptop. Foster's union rep leaned over and whispered, "Don't say a word, Derek. They have the footage." The DOJ agent pressed play. The high-definition, crystal-clear video from Foster's own Axon body 3-camera filled the screen. It was damning. The video showed Jackson's car safely pulling into the brightly lit gas station. It captured Jackson's windows down, his hands perfectly visible on the wheel. The audio was pristine. It picked up Jackson's calm, professional warning. "I am an off-duty federal law enforcement officer. I am armed. How would you like me to proceed?" It captured Foster's belligerent, profane response. It showed Foster ripping the door open. It showed Jackson sitting still, offering absolutely zero physical resistance, repeatedly trying to de-escalate. And then it showed Foster unholstering his taser and firing 50,000 volts into a compliant man's chest without warning, cause, or justification. As the video played the sound of Jackson agonizingly groaning in pain, Foster watched his own career evaporate frame by frame. The "feared for my life" defense, the golden shield that had protected him from previous excessive force complaints, was useless here. He hadn't just brutalized a citizen, he had assaulted a sworn officer of the United States government who was following protocol perfectly. "Turn it off," the union lawyer muttered, rubbing his temples. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. The DOJ agent paused the video and looked directly at Foster. "Derek Foster, you are hereby stripped of your police powers. You are suspended without pay, pending termination. Furthermore, you are the target of a federal grand jury investigation for violations of 18 U.S. Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." Foster's jaw dropped. "Section 242, That's a federal civil rights charge. You can't do this. I made a mistake, that's all. He didn't comply fast enough." "A mistake is a typo on a parking ticket," the DOJ agent said coldly. "Assaulting an unresisting citizen with a deadly weapon because your ego was bruised is a federal crime. And when that citizen is a federal agent, the blue wall of silence you rely on does not exist. Your own department handed this footage to us on a silver platter." Foster looked at his chief, expecting backup, expecting the Brotherhood to protect him. The chief simply looked away in disgust. Foster was toxic waste and no one was going to risk their pension to save him. The arrest warrant was issued 3 days later. Foster was taken into custody not by his former colleagues, but by the FBI. He was handcuffed with rigid, heavy-duty federal irons, ironically by Special Agent Curtis Jackson himself, who read him his Miranda rights in the same calm, steady voice he had used in the gas station. As the metal cuffs clicked shut around Foster's wrists, the reality finally set in. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta is a hulking structure of steel and glass, a monument to the relentless, grinding machinery of federal justice. Inside courtroom 4B, Derek Foster sat at the defense table, looking pale, shrunken, and terrified. Gone was the swagger. Gone was the uniform. He wore a cheap grey suit that hung off his suddenly gaunt frame. The trial lasted only 4 days. It was a slaughter. Foster's high-priced defense attorney tried every trick in the book. He tried to argue the tinted windows made the car suspicious. He tried to argue that Jackson's refusal to step out of the car instantly constituted a threat. But every argument shattered against the undeniable reality of the Axon body camera footage, which the prosecution played for the jury 3 separate times. The prosecution, led by a ruthless assistant U.S. attorney, systematically dismantled Foster's history. The judge allowed previous complaints of excessive force to be entered into evidence to establish a pattern of behavior, a legal concept known as modus operandi. The jury saw not a cop making a split-second mistake in a dangerous situation, but a violent bully who routinely used his badge as a license to terrorize the public. When Special Agent Curtis Jackson took the stand, the courtroom was dead silent. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit. He didn't speak with anger or vengeance. He spoke with clinical precision, detailing the physiological agony of the taser deployment and the absolute lack of legal justification for the stop. His quiet dignity stood in stark, devastating contrast to the violent, screaming thug captured on the video. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreperson read the verdict, the words echoed like hammer strikes. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, violating 18 U.S.C. Section 242, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the charge of filing a false police report, guilty. Foster collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. The reality of his future was a crushing weight. 2 months later, sentencing day arrived. The federal judge, a stern woman appointed known for taking civil rights violations incredibly seriously, looked down at Foster from the bench. "Mr. Foster, the power granted to law enforcement officers is a sacred trust. It is the power over life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You weaponize that trust," the judge said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You targeted a man based on your own internal biases. You escalated a peaceful encounter into violence purely to satisfy your own fragile ego. You disgraced the badge you wore, and you endangered the life of a public servant." Foster stood, trembling, waiting for the final blow. "I sentence you to 180 months, 15 years, in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons," the judge declared, striking her gavel, "without the possibility of parole." 15 years, a decade and a half. The U.S. Marshals stepped forward, grabbing Foster by the arms. As they led him out of the courtroom toward the holding cells, Foster locked eyes with Curtis Jackson one last time. Jackson was sitting in the gallery watching quietly. Jackson gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph, but a simple acknowledgement of cause and effect. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing Derek Foster's fate. The arrogant cop who believed he was above the law had just been crushed by it. The 50,000 volts of electricity he had unleashed had completed their circuit, shocking his life to an absolute, unceremonious end. Justice, blind and unyielding, had finally arrived. And that is the incredible, satisfying story of how an arrogant, power-hungry cop let his ego write a check that his badge couldn't cash. Officer Derek Foster thought he was untouchable, preying on innocent drivers to fuel his own God complex. But the universe has a funny way of serving up hard karma, and messing with a calm, heavily armed FBI agent like Curtis Jackson proved to be the ultimate fatal mistake. 15 years in federal prison is a long time to think about 50,000 volts of bad decisions. If you love hearing stories where corrupt bullies finally get a massive dose of instant karma and justice is served cold, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on these intense, true-to-life dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Agent Jackson? Share this video with a friend, and I'll see you in the next one.